How many of you would say that you have a place where you really feel roots, where you just have a depth of family history? Any of you have a place like that? Where is it? Any of you willing to share briefly? No? Where? Anthony?
We started coming here when I was a kid.
Okay.
And then I quit coming here when I turned 18, but then when me and Kristen were looking to get married, we came back.
Okay. Wonderful. So that's here in the church. Yeah. Wonderful. Anyone else? Julie? Alliance? Yeah. Gina? Your parents' farm. Yeah. Yeah, for me, it feels like that back in my hometown in Pennsylvania, but actually that's not where the Hoovler roots really go deep. That's in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, closer to the Ohio border. There was a John Hoovler who came over to America in the 1760s and moved to Mercer County sometime in the late 1700s. And actually, you can barely see it in that picture there, but this is in a cemetery in Mercer County. And there's just a flat headstone there kind of in the center of that picture. And that's John's marker when he died there and was buried in that cemetery in 1832. So generations going back. For Ginger's family, that's Iowa. When we were in Texas, I was talking with my brother-in-law, and he was remembering how a number of years ago he and his dad were up in Iowa, and they found an old family cemetery behind a field. Literally, they had to turn off the highway and drive around the edge of a farmer's field to get to this cemetery, but in there, almost all of the headstones were for Andersons, and they were all related to the family. It was where roots ran deep, even though he had never been there before. In both of our cases, it was our grandparents who left those places. My family moved just a little bit to the south. Ginger's grandfather headed for Arkansas, and then the next generation went to Texas. But of course, even those places of deep rooting, this is America, so it only goes back so far. John Hoovler had come over from Holland, the Andersons from Denmark. We're all immigrants if you go back a little ways. And Abram in the Bible was called out of a place of roots for him, called him away from everything he knew to go to a foreign land. And over the next few weeks, I'd like to look at this call that God put on Abram's life and how he responded to that. It's in Genesis chapters 12 and 13 is the section we'll be looking at, kind of leapfrogging our way through these chapters over the next few weeks. And as we look at the call that he put on his life, even in the time before he renamed him Abraham, we see Abram facing different aspects that followed that call. And so we're going to be looking at faith and famine, at fear and faithfulness. And this week, we're starting at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. And as you're able, I'd invite you to stand as we open God's Word together. Genesis 12, beginning at the beginning of the chapter. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. May God add his blessing to this word. You may be seated. So this morning, as we look at kind of the beginning of this story, I'd like to consider what God called Abram from, what God called Abram to, and how he calls us in very much the same way. So first, what God called Abram from, and as it has on the screen, he called him from three distinct things right there in that very first verse: his country, his people, and his father's household. And those things would have made up the very core of who Abram was. Because these three areas made up the primary components of a person's identity, in the ancient world especially. Your country or your land was your means of survival. It was your livelihood. It was your political identity, what place you were a part of. And your people or your clan located you in history and in society. They were your past, your status, your relationships, your responsibilities, your privileges. And then your father's household provided your most basic sense of who you were, even more so than your individual self. You would keep alive the memory of your family line, and your household would ensure that you were cared for. There was no retirement accounts or Social Security in those days. Your family line was your security for the future. And God called Abram away from everything that gave him identity within his culture. And he also called Abram away from every other divine connection. We can easily miss this, but that description, those three things, also covered the various levels of deities and spirits that surrounded life in the ancient world. You worshiped the gods of your nation or your city, the gods of your place. We see this throughout the Old Testament. People will refer to Dagon, the god of the Philistines in Ashdod, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Molech, the god of Ammon, Ashtoreth, the goddess of Sidon. There were gods who were associated with a particular place, a particular nation. And people worshipped the gods of their people, somewhat lower-level deities who had adopted their family or who their family had adopted as their patron deities of their extended clan or their family. And then people would worship their household gods, their ancestors from generations past who had taken a place in the divine realm as spirits. This was the religious landscape of the ancient Near East. And these gods all required appeasement. You had to flatter them, to provide for them with sacrifices. You had to keep them happy so they wouldn't do you harm. And if you were lucky, you could manipulate them into doing you good. But God told Abram to leave behind everything that gave a connection to the divine, to anything other than God himself, just as he called Abram away from everything that defined who he was. And so God calls you and me today from many of those same things. Jesus said in Matthew 10, "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." I don't know about you, but if you stop and think about that, that can sound pretty controlling, doesn't it? I kind of think, if you were to have a boyfriend or girlfriend or fiance talk like this, that'd be a pretty big red flag that you need to kind of watch for that. But at the same time, isn't this what we promise in marriage? to love, to honor, and cherish, forsaking all others. And I have seen cases where prioritizing children, prioritizing parents above one's spouse cause big problems within a marriage. And if Jesus is who he said he is, God himself, and if he talks about the church as the bride of Christ, it's only right for him to require that level of devotion, just as he did for Abram. Now, God probably won't call most of us to leave our families for him, but that has happened for many Christians throughout history, even today. The Fanes talk about this in the situation that new believers face in Thailand. Choosing Jesus sometimes means that friends and family will disapprove or walk away. And God calls all of us to set aside anything else that would define our identity before God. He calls us to set aside our country or patriotism or livelihood or property, our background, our failures and struggles and generational sins, or our successes, our prosperity, our generational pride. Everything that gives us our identity, from our family to our personality to our dreams for the future, needs to be in its proper place, below him. He calls us to leave it all behind and let him define who we are. Not our past, not our environment, not even our own personality, but who he says we are. And he calls us to set aside anything else that would tempt us to worship it above him or beside him. Our cultural values and worldviews, the systems and structures and stuff that we look to for our security, and even our own skills, our own knowledge, our self-reliance in making life work on our own. God says, leave all those things behind, because all of our worship and trust need to be focused on him and him alone. But God did not just call Abram to leave things behind. He didn't just call him from, he also called him to. And what did he call him to? Well, he called Abram to go to the land I will show you. He called him to a land. My mom tells a story about when she was learning to drive. Once her older brother agreed to give her some practice, so they set out down the road. He told her, turn left up here, then turn right, keep going, so on. Eventually, he told her to pull over at a wide spot in the road out in the country. Okay, he said, now get us home. But I don't know where we are, she said. You need to pay attention to that sort of thing when you're driving. You'll figure it out. And then he didn't say another word to her. I think she had some words for him, but she eventually found her way home. God did not give Abram specifics about where he was going and the land that he was sending him to. As we'll actually look at in more detail next week, I think that's very significant. Abram just had to trust God. But God's call was more than just a land, it was a promise. God promised that he would make Abram into a great nation. And this is very unusual. I think we know the story of Abram, many of us, and so we just take this for granted, that God takes Abram and makes him into a nation. But no other God in the ancient world promised that to somebody. There would be accounts of a God promising someone that he would be a king or that he would have many descendants. But nowhere else does a God say to a person, I will make you into a great nation, except for the God of Abram. God says he will make Abram's name great. That's a very interesting choice of words, because in just the previous chapter, chapter 11 of Genesis, we have the account of the Tower of Babel. And what was the main motivation for building that tower, if you know that story? It was to make a name for themselves. They said, we will do this so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth, which, by the way, was what God had told them to do, was to spread through the whole earth. But God tells Abram, making a name for yourself is not the answer. That desire is rooted in pride, in an independence that doesn't leave room for God. In fact, as Jesus would say later, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. God says, Abram, if you give up trying to make a name for yourself and instead follow me, I will make your name great. Then God says he will protect Abram. He will judge others based on how they treat him. He'll be treated, those who treat him well will be treated well. Those who treat him poorly will be cursed. Notice it's interesting that he doesn't say nobody will ever curse you, just that God will protect him in the midst of that. And finally, you might have noticed a word that's just peppered throughout this whole speech of God's. Bless. It shows up 5 times in 2 verses. It's kind of hard to miss. I will bless you, God says. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. I want to look into this in more detail next week. But God says that Abram will receive his favor. He will be a conduit of God's blessing to all peoples on earth. And you know, you and I actually can enter into Abram's blessing, because we can know the one who fulfilled God's promise that all peoples on earth would be blessed through Abram. Jesus, descended from Abram's line, came to restore to God all broken people of every tribe and tongue and nation. And as the spiritual children of Abraham, the church carries that promise today, that God wants to bless all peoples on earth through us. So how did Abram respond to this call from God? And what does that mean for you and me? How should we respond? Well, we read here, so Abram went as the Lord had told him. He responded with obedience, right? He got up and went. The verse makes it sound just immediate, unflinching. Abram is just the prime example of doing the right thing, right? But let's look back just a few verses, the end of the previous chapter. We read there, Terah, Abram's father, took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. In the book of Acts, Stephen says that God's call to Abram came while Abram was still living in Ur. So with his father and his wife and his nephew, Abram set out from Ur, but then they stopped in Haran. And here's the thing. Haran wasn't even on the way. Ur is over there on the right side of the map, in the southern part of what's now Iraq, near the Persian Gulf. Canaan, of course, is that other circle over by the Mediterranean. And the most direct highway between those two places, if you avoid the desert, was to go through Babylon up the Euphrates River, hang a left at Mari, go toward Damascus, and go south from there. That was a long trip, close to 900 miles. That's almost as long as the trip that we took to Texas, but this was on foot. But Haran was 200 miles north of Mari. Going through Haran would have added 400 miles to their trip. That'd be like going from here to Pittsburgh by way of Buffalo. Doesn't make any sense. And they weren't just stopping for the night at Haran. They weren't just staying in the Motel 6 there. They settled in Haran. Abram was not as quick to follow God as we often think. He took a detour, quite a big one. He stalled out. He settled in Haran. And I think that's so important, because it is not the obedience of Abram that is praised in the Bible. Because let's be honest, his record on obedience was spotty at best. But what we remember of Abram is his faith. His faith is what God really wanted. That doesn't mean that obedience doesn't matter, that it doesn't matter what we do. There's right and wrong, sin is real, and obeying God matters. But notice something about God's call to Abram. There's nothing in there about religious ritual. There are no moral requirements, no good works that Abram had to do to earn God's blessing. God's blessing to Abram is not conditioned on what Abram does. God doesn't say, if you go from Ur to Canaan, if you go straight there and don't take any stops along the way, follow all the rules, then I will make you into a great nation and bless you. No. Abram's obedience followed God's grace and blessing. And his obedience wasn't perfect. He took detours. Haran was not the last. And for us today, the message of God's call of the cross isn't that we need to follow religious ritual or obey moral commands so that we can earn God's favor. The message of the cross is that we can't. So Jesus came to fulfill the law that we could not, to take on himself the punishment that our sin and detours deserve, so that we could receive his standing before the Father. Abram responded in faith. And so should we. Faith doesn't mean we have it all figured out. Faith doesn't mean that we always do all the right things. Faith doesn't even mean that we trust God completely and flawlessly. Faith just means that we believe him, that we commit ourselves to him, that we seek him and follow him in the fullest way that we can in each moment. Because even if our following is faltering and slow, even if we find ourselves on a detour, Abram shows us that you and I are not disqualified from God's call. So today, if you've never responded to that call, please hear him today. Stop hoping you're good enough. Stop trying and striving after happiness or security. Just accept in faith what Jesus did for you because of his love for you. Form your identity in him, in his finished work to restore you to himself. Now maybe, this is probably a lot of us, we did respond to that call. It might even look like you've gone a long way for him. But if you're honest, you're on a bit of a detour this morning. You're kind of off the path. You've settled in Haran. If you look around and you're honest, you've settled for something less than what he has for you. You're not where he has called you to be. Abram reminds us it's never too late to respond in faith. And if you are following him today, if you are where he has called you to be, may Abram be a reminder that you and I are not called just for our own sake. The promise to Abram is to be fulfilled through us, that all peoples on earth may be blessed through him and through Jesus. So be a blessing to those around you, so that they too might know the good news of faith in him.